Well, good morning. Thank you very much for coming. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I did give a lecture here once before in this room in about 2012. And also, I was present here when Colin Firth was filming a scene in this very room, appropriately, when they were watching with the Archbishop of Canterbury a film of the 1937 Coronation. And he was sitting in a deck chair, and he fell through the deck chair onto the ground, and I'm afraid everybody laughed, and his comment was, that was probably more enjoyable for you than it was for me. But anyway, so it's nice to be back. Thank you very much for coming. We have moved from, obviously, the iconic image of the Queen in 1953 to a new king. It's happened. King Charles has been recognised, anointed, consecrated, crowned, enthroned, and blessed. It was my role to be an ITN guest on the day, and as so often, of course, like all commentators, I felt that I wasn't allowed to speak very much. And so it's very nice to have the opportunity to say one or two of the things here that I wasn't allowed to do. We always end up like fishes, you know, our mouths open and then somebody else speaks over you. But I had a wonderful view of the arrivals and departures at the west door of Westminster Abbey, and one or two of the photographs that I'll show you come from that. But first of all, let's just look at a few of the events that lead us up to the coronation. As you know, we lost our Queen on the 8th of September. I think it's something that's been very hard to come to terms with after a magnificent reign of 70 years. I cannot think of anybody in global public life who made a promise at the age of 21 and kept it faithfully for 75 years. And I think if we lived for 1,000 years, we would never, ever see anything like that again. Her frequently acerbic private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, said of her, "Her serenity was constant, her wisdom faultless. On the whole, I consider her the most remarkable woman I have ever met." And during the 22 months that Lascelles was her private secretary, seeing her almost daily, he wrote, "Her immediate grasp of the routine business of kingship was remarkable. She never seemed to need an explanation on any point. She had an intuitive grasp of the problems of government and indeed of life generally, that I suppose had descended to her from Queen Victoria." Sometimes when I go to schools to talk about the Queen, I show this picture, the contrast between the Duke of Windsor and the Queen. He was about 70 when that photograph was taken, and she was 88. He took the perceived path of happiness, and she followed the path of duty. And her eyes are sparkling, whereas his eyes are dead. I only saw him once in life. I've never seen a man with such sad eyes. But during those last couple of years of the Queen's reign, when she was at Windsor Castle during the pandemic, obviously in April 2021, she lost Prince Philip, and she went on, as you know, to celebrate her Platinum Jubilee. And there were some things during that year that she wasn't able to do, so we began to see what you might call an aspect of transition. And one of the things that I must admit I wouldn't have let her do if I was her private secretary, although she was intending to do it, was to read the speech at the opening of Parliament on the 10th of May 2022, a convoluted speech live on television under hot television lights. So Prince Charles did that on her behalf, and you'll remember the imperial state crown was seated beside him. So in a sense, what we saw then was a king in waiting. And again, at the birthday parade, Trooping the Colour, he took the parade splendidly on her behalf. And what was rather nice was that when she appeared on the balcony, he kind of slipped into the background and she took centre stage again. So I thought they balanced that extremely well. You see her there with the Duke of Kent, patron of the Newbury Festival, who's also Colonel of the Scots Guards. And she said to him on that occasion, "Are you going to salute?" And he said, "Yes, I am, actually." She said, "Well, don't knock my hat off," she said. Then, as you know, she didn't take a very big part in the actual Platinum Jubilee, but she did a certain number of things, and she went up to Scotland for her holiday at Balmoral, and there came the moment of the transition between Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And I think it's fascinating to think that in 1952, the very first thing she did when she came down the steps from the aeroplane was to shake the hands of a man born in 1874, her first Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill. And that the very last thing that she did, literally 2 days before she died, was to shake the hands of a Prime Minister born in 1975, over 100 years later. So there she is, meeting Liz Truss at Balmoral. And so she died on the 8th of September, and I think you all agree that the King's address was absolutely splendid on the night of the 9th of September. He spoke to us as a king. He was looking out towards us. He was wondering what we were thinking, what we were feeling at a time when possibly we should have been consoling him. I thought that was extremely encouraging. Now, the transition from one monarch to another is usually very straightforward, and I'll show you some of the processes that people go through for that. But what was interesting was that in 1936, the Illustrated London News produced a splendid portrait of Edward VIII in his coronation robes, which they intended to use in their edition. And then, of course, he abdicated. So what did they do? They simply snapped his head off and they stuck on the head of George VI instead. So even when it's difficult, they do manage to make these things work to their advantage. The first thing, of course, that the king had to do was to go to the Accession Council, which we saw on television for the first time. It's an important procedure. He meets privy councillors and what's described as men and women of importance, and he makes the accession declaration, basically his willingness to serve as king. And after that has been done, and he's been accepted by them, comes the proclamation from Friary Court at St James's Palace, also Charing Cross, Chancery Lane, the Royal Exchange, places like Windsor, Edinburgh and York. And that, of course, is the old-fashioned way of telling the world that we have a new king. There then followed the state funeral of the Queen, and the reason I show you these pictures really is to introduce the crown jewels, because the imperial state crown, the sceptre with the cross, and also the orb were on the Queen's coffin during those times. Saying goodbye to the Queen was a fantastic process. We don't have all the inside details yet of what happened behind the scenes at the coronation, but we do have quite a lot of behind-the-scenes information about what happened during Operation London Bridge. So half the King's troop were on summer leave. They had to come back, move their operation from Woolwich to Wellington Barracks, because they were going to fire the death gun salute of 96 guns. The state trumpeters had flown to Canada on a visit. They'd arrived there 24 hours before, and they were immediate for the proclamation, so straight back on the plane, and they were rehearsing at the Royal Exchange at 10 o'clock at night as revellers spilt out of the pubs. The Queen's Company, Grenadier Guards, were serving on Operation Shader in Iraq, and back they came to act as bearer party and escort to their former company commander. And it was their camp colour, which had been with them in Iraq, which was placed on the Queen's coffin. The garrison sergeant major took one look at them and he immediately commanded a haircut, and I understand that he kept a comb on his person at all times thereafter. Brigadier James Stopford, a gentleman-at-arms, was in Corfu at his daughter's wedding. He was in the middle of his speech when his phone vibrated. He proposed a toast to his daughter and then to the memory of the Queen and flew home the next day to take part in the lying in state, at which some 300 officers also took part. And during the next days, at operational headquarters, the following words were never heard. These were no, impossible, too difficult, and can't. Everybody rallied around to give a much-loved monarch a spectacular farewell. And then, of course, in St George's Chapel, you saw some of the ceremonial, which I think people found terribly interesting. For example, the breaking of the wand of the Lord Chamberlain to symbolise that his duties as Lord Chamberlain to the Queen were over. He's actually been reappointed to the new king, but he breaks his wand. And then why the barge master taking the imperial state crown off the coffin? Well, the reason for that, you'll find him always on the coach at the state opening of Parliament. It's simply because in earlier times, whenever the crown jewels were brought to the Palace of Westminster for the opening of Parliament, they always came by river. So the barge master took a part. And I think that people found that terribly interesting. I mean, there was a wonderful procession, I'm sure you all saw it. And the only thing apparently which went wrong, which I'm sure you all noticed on the television, which upset the brigade major, was that the procession at Windsor Castle from Shaw Farm Gate departed 1 minute late at 14:07. The reason for that, of course, was there were so many crowds on the way looking at the Queen's coffin as it went past. And in the next days, the new king had to deal with a change of prime minister after 44 days. One of the things which perhaps will have escaped you, wouldn't have noticed so much, was the addresses from the privileged bodies. That's one of the things which happens. The Lord Mayor of Westminster there, they're all meant to take 2 minutes each, apparently, to do these things. So there are quite a few of them. But the Archbishop of Canterbury failed to read his briefing notes and spoke for an agonizing 5 minutes, apparently, which worried the other ones who were coming along. And then, of course, there came along the question as to what sort of a coronation should it be. Should it be modest or should it be magnificent? Well, the purpose of a coronation is to affirm the new monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England. That's the real reason for it. And I must say that when I was asked about this on ITN, I said, I think it'd be the best economic boost to this country, boost to morale. I think everyone will agree we've had a fantastic weekend, the best thing that could possibly happen for Britain. But of course, there were mealy-mouthed people who said that, there was a bad time to have a coronation when people were unable to pay their domestic bills and so forth. That was said by Robert Lacey, for example, on the BBC, a man who I think wears, in my opinion, a rather light suit, but there we are. If you subscribe to his view, this is not the talk for you at all. Now, the coronation, of course, takes place in Westminster Abbey, the royal family's church in London, dating back to 1066. 39 monarchs had been crowned there before, including William the Conqueror in 1066. And many kings and queens are buried there, have been since between 1272 and 1760. People like Henry VII and Elizabeth I. Royal weddings and funerals, obviously, and the Queen's state funeral in 2022. And coronations over the years have been very magnificent, like the coronation of George IV. And you see all the stands that were specially built. This time, they didn't do what they did in 1953. They literally closed the Abbey on the 1st of January. They had a tram line going up the Abbey to take all the construction work, to build stands to seat 8,237 people. So this time, there were only 2,000 people there. So inevitably, there were a lot of disgruntled people who thought they should be there and who couldn't be. But as we'll see later, the one great guest that was present in every nook and cranny of the Abbey were the television cameras, and they did a fantastic job. But it's interesting that it required 450 tons of structural steel, 132,000 cubic feet of timber, 1,350,000 feet of tubular scaffolding, and then the Abbey was then closed until the 1st of November, after the coronation then being on the 2nd of June, and while they took it all down again. So that was quite a big thing. Now, we didn't get a proclamation for the coronation this time, and of course, by and large, we didn't get peers in coronation robes. However, we did. Those are the standard bearers in 1911, and these are the standard bearers that came out on this occasion. As you see, actually, quite a few peers I noticed were wearing coronation robes, and very good thing too, because why not if you've got them? And it looks much more splendid. So a couple of the Duke of Westminster is there bearing one of the, I think the other one's the Earl of Caledon. But otherwise, I think the peers were either told to come in lounge suits or parliamentary robes. On the left-hand side, you see the parliamentary robes. But the Duke of Wellington, carrying Queen Mary's crown, he certainly got out his full coronation robes. I had this spectacular view from just opposite Westminster Abbey. So I didn't take the picture of the troops arriving by train, but I did take this picture here of the peers and other guests arriving at 7:30 in the morning. And I also saw, which on the whole we didn't see on the television, the choristers arriving and all the kings and queens of Europe and members of European royal houses, because of course the television cameras always focus on the king and queen in their coach. Here's the Archbishop, and here, interestingly, these are not very good photographs which I snitched off the television, but I wanted to show you Lord Airlie, because he is 97 on the 17th of May, and he is the only person who was actually present at the 1937 coronation at the age of 10, when he was a page, and of course he went on to be Lord Chamberlain to the Queen. The Archbishop, well, I'm not quite sure what to say about him. I rather lost it with him, I confess, when I read his notes about the coronation, because he stressed always, I think the word woke is the right word. He stressed all those aspects of the service, and he seemed to sort of feel that historical tradition and things were something he should push away into the past. But there we are, that's what he did. He also introduced a sermon, which I think was completely unnecessary. There wasn't a sermon in 1953, but he wanted to get his points across. Now, as to what they were wearing, no princesses in purple velvet trains. That's 1911 Princess Mary, and that's the future Duke of Windsor as Prince of Wales. But members of the royal family, none of the commentators seem to know what they were wearing, so I just want to get this off my chest and tell you what they were wearing. Prince Michael of Kent was dressed in the robes of the Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, which was also what the royal ladies were wearing, as you'll see. Here is a picture of the Duke of Kent in garter robes with his brother, and Princess Alexandra, who was wearing the Royal Victorian Order robes as well. The Duke of Gloucester, Knight of the Garter, with the Duchess of Gloucester in the robes of the Royal Victorian Order. I wonder what the late Duke of Norfolk would have made of Princess Anne. She was riding as gold stick in waiting. She was wearing the ribbon of the garter and the collar of the thistle. I was sure she'd wear her thistle robes, but technically she should have worn the collar of the thistle robes over the thistle robes and not underneath them, but never mind. It was good to see her there. These things, nobody minds about these things anymore. I'm completely happy now to become a yesterday's man. I belong to the last reign, and I shall go down with the ship very happily. But I wanted to tell you these things. Prince Harry, as you know, appeared wearing the KCVO star, and Prince Andrew, quite rightly, was allowed to wear his garter robes. He is a Knight of the Garter, and so that's what he was wearing. And then you've got Prince Edward, again, Duke of Edinburgh, in garter robes with Sophie in the robes of the Royal Victorian Order. And likewise, you got the Prince of Wales and Catherine in the same robes. Now, one of the things which was quite interesting to see, where from my position, was that the King's coach, the Diamond Jubilee State coach, drew up, and then nothing happened for ages. And the reason for this was that cars were hurtling down Birdcage Walk, bringing the Prince and Princess of Wales and their children about 4 minutes late. So why they were late, we don't know, but I mean, they have small children who behaved impeccably and wonderfully throughout the whole thing. It is, of course, quite possible that they didn't behave quite so well back at home as they were getting dressed. Who knows? We do not know these things. But what a fantastic pair they were, Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte. He actually, for once, instructing her about something, which is usually the other way around. And Prince George, of course, as you'll see later, was a page. So all the royal family sat at the side, waiting there, and Prince George was one of the pages. Here's a picture of him on the balcony. Now, again, I think I'm the only person, actually I know one other person, who's rather out of tune with the admirable Lord President of the Council, who I have to give full marks to for carrying the sword of state during all this time. But I couldn't help feeling that somehow she belonged slightly from another planet. And I wondered, again, what Duke Bernard would have had to say about it. The Duke of Norfolk, who arranged the 1953 coronation, was an absolute genius. He worked out that the platform had to have seasoned wood in case people creaked as they walked up on it. He addressed the slippers of the pages, of the maids of honour. No detail was too small for him. And one peer asked him nervously, will I be summoned to the coronation? Because I'm afraid I'm divorced. And the Duke said, this is a coronation, not royal ascot. He also, when he addressed press councils, press conferences, he said that he thought that it was very difficult sometimes to get the balance between dignified reporting and what he called colour being introduced into it. But he handled it incredibly well. As far as I know, the present Duke didn't actually have quite so much a hand in this coronation as his predecessor, and because I think the government took over. So you got different features this time. You got heads of state like President Macron, you had kings and queens of Europe. Normally they don't have them there at a coronation because they feel it should just be focused on the sovereign, British sovereign. And interestingly, for example, at the 1953 coronation, Queen Louise of Sweden wasn't allowed to come, even though she was an aunt of Prince Philip, and nor were King Paul and Queen Frederica of Greece, because obviously he belonged to the Greek royal family. But being a bit mischievous, I also wondered what the Lord President of the Council in 1953, Lord Salisbury, would have thought about the present Lord President. And I show you a picture of him dressed in his robes, a picture of him in the middle, a picture of Penny Mordaunt, and also a rather famous picture, which I shall rush past rather quickly, of what she was once shown as in her earlier life. So it is an interesting trajectory, I think, don't you, from the one to the other. Being more serious, they travelled to the coronation in the Diamond Jubilee State coach. This meant that the King and Queen were able to arrive without feeling seasick, because William IV said that the travelling in the Gold State coach was rather like being tossed about on the high seas. And here you see, this is another picture that I took of him arriving. And again, Queen Camilla arriving at the Abbey door, when they eventually got out of the coach, and indeed the King. And they introduced then a rather touching new feature into this service, which was the chorister from the Chapel Royal who addressed the King, and the King then said, "I come here not to be served, but to serve." And personally, I think that would have been nice if we just left it at that. We got the point, but the Archbishop had to make a sermon in which he said the same thing all over again. Never mind. Here is a picture of the Queen at the recognition. This was in 1953 done by the Archbishop, but this time he introduced a Lady of the Thistle and Baroness Amos as Lady of the Garter and a George Crossholder. They all in turn, as you know, presented the King to different parts of the Abbey. And I thought that was probably rather a nice touch, nicely done. The reason for the recognition is quite simply to make sure that you've got the right person. We know we have on this occasion, but as you can imagine, in the past, in history, it wasn't always the case. And then the oath, when the Queen took the oath, she actually named countries that she was Queen of, such as South Africa, Pakistan, and what was then called Ceylon. This time, they rather fudged it, and they just talked about, very much stressed the United Kingdom, of course, but they also just stressed the other realms over which he reigned. Another very nice touch this time, of course, was that the oil for the anointing came from the Mount of Olives, whereas you may know Prince Philip's mother, who was incredibly brave during the war in Athens and hid a Jewish family, was eventually buried in the crypt of the Russian convent on the Mount of Olives. So it was nice that they had this sort of link to Prince Philip's mother. And they also had introduced some Greek music, as you probably heard in the service, out of respect to Prince Philip. One of the things I must say I did regret very much was that the Garter Knights were not allowed to come out with a wonderful gold canopy for the anointing, as they have done since the coronation, I think, of Henry VI, going all the way back. Somebody told me that it was something to do with COVID, and they felt that they ought to have this screen, which I personally didn't like, around him. And then they said, oh, well, it wasn't time to make a gold canopy. Well, where was the other gold canopy? It must have been somewhere. Anyway, I don't know what you thought about that, but I didn't personally madly like it. Anyway, that's a feature. Of course, Prince Charles, in 1953, had been present at his mother's coronation. He was brought in at the last minute to sit next to the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. And the Archbishop of Canterbury duly crowned the Queen, at which point, and we lose another feature by and large in this coronation, which was that at that point all the peers and peeresses simultaneously put on their coronets, which must have been a wonderful moment. It's one that Prince Charles does actually remember seeing. But when the Archbishop crowned the King, you may not have noticed, but actually the kings of arms, which is to say the senior heralds, of which there were about 6, I think, they did put on their crowns. So you can see one of them with his crown on at that point. And then you get this business of the homage. In 1953, Prince Philip was one of the people doing homage. It was first the Archbishop, then the 3 royal dukes, Duke of Edinburgh, Duke of Gloucester, the Duke of Kent, then the senior peer of each of the grades of the peerage, so Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount and Baron. This time it was just the Archbishop, and then it was the Prince of Wales, which I think was that was a moment that people very much enjoyed. And then they had this thing called the homage to the people. Now, I haven't quite got to the bottom of this one yet. It is suggested that it was an idea of the Archbishop to put it in, but I cannot really believe that Buckingham Palace hadn't seen this in the programme. If you look at the original service sheet, he definitely does say that the people can do a homage by desire. So he wasn't actually commanding people to do it. But, as you know, the press immediately, we have a hostile media, immediately created a big fuss about this. And so they changed it. And it does look a little bit like as if the royal comms, as they're called at Buckingham Palace, rather threw the Archbishop under a train, because I think it wasn't entirely the Archbishop's fault. However, they did actually change this. And I thought to myself, personally, what do I think about this, doing this homage? You said, you know, if you're in the Abbey or elsewhere, in other words, on your television screen or on your iPhone or whatever. And actually, I personally would have preferred that my loyalty to the King should be taken for granted. When we deputy lieutenants do citizenship ceremonies, of course we ask the new citizens to affirm or swear allegiance to the monarch and to their successors. But we're already here, so I think in a way I'd prefer that. And I assume, in a way, I don't know if you agree with me, that by singing the national anthem, we do from time to time make that point. That definitely went wrong, no question about it. Then, of course, the crowns. So Queen Camilla was crowned with Queen Mary's crown, and they were a bit shied away from using the crown of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, because it contained the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Once again, the media stirred up trouble. I watched Good Morning Britain one day, and there was an activist screaming and shouting, saying, Koh-i-Noor diamond ought to go back to India. Some people would say it should go back to Iran, others to Afghanistan. Other people should say it should stay exactly where it is in the Tower of London. But the presenters were sitting there grinning from ear to ear with delight at a controversy made out of the Koh-i-Noor diamond. And I don't know about you, but I don't think the man in the street is spending much time thinking about the Koh-i-Noor diamond. And certainly, when the Queen Mother wore it, nobody ever complained about it, and it was on her coffin in 2002, and she actually also brought it out of the Tower of London to upstage General de Gaulle on his state visit in 1960, when she wore it without the bars on the top, the arches. And actually, luckily, the media didn't know this, the Koh-i-Noor diamond used to be in Queen Mary's crown until 1937, when it was transferred to the other one. But Queen Mary's crown this time contained 3 of the Cullinan diamonds, which, as far as I know, hasn't stirred the media up to any controversy. President Botha gave those to Edward VII in 1907. The Cullinan 1 is in the sceptre with the cross, Cullinan 2 is in the imperial state crown, and now Cullinans 3, 4 and 5 are in this crown. As you probably know, the Queen used to wear 2 of those as a brooch. Anyway, she was duly crowned with that. 1 or 2 more snaps of what I saw from my little stand of the troops. We're very lucky because during the service, of course, all these 6,000 troops, you know, whatever it was, marched past and formed up for the journey back, and that procession was a mile long. So we saw wonderful scenes of this happening, and then the Gold State coach, drew up. As I say, it was built by George III and first used at the coronation of William IV and has been used at all coronations since then. So that was very special. And then, okay, Princess Anne, here she is riding as Gold Stick, which was great. And Princess Anne, of course, she always gets everything absolutely right. And in her interview beforehand, one of the comments she made was she was delighted to be riding in this procession. It also solved her dress problem. She didn't have to order a dress for this occasion. Princess Charlotte in the Diamond Jubilee State coach, and a rather nice photograph I took of the heralds going home. Well, in 1953, what's really interesting is there was a big discussion about television, and nobody originally wanted it because they thought that it would put a great stress on the Queen. In 1937, the coronation had been filmed, but the Archbishop and the Duke of Norfolk went through the film, and they took out bits that they didn't like. One of the things they took out in 1937 was that Queen Mary was very moved during the anointing, and she burst into tears, and so they edited that out. But with television, you couldn't really do that. And so they were worried about this. But what was rather splendid was that they, when they were thinking of introducing it, as you can imagine, the Archbishop and the Duke were not exactly technical experts. So the cameraman managed to just change the lens so it all looked long distance. And then they said, well, that's all right, that's fine. That'll be all right. There were going to be no close-ups at all of the Queen during the coronation. But can you imagine that actually they had a camera above the west door, so the procession going in was only seen from behind. And then as they came out, okay, you saw it from the front. And when they got to the organ screen, then of course there was another camera that picked them up, which took them forward. But towards the end, I'm delighted to tell you that the cameraman, once the service was over, he saw the Queen coming out from the recess, wearing the imperial state crown, and he just moved his lens in closer and closer and closer. And the man with the button, who was there to press the button to stop the filming if anything went wrong or if anyone misbehaved, to his eternal credit, he did not press the button. And so you got, and you can see it actually as a moving image, you saw this picture of the Queen as she came out from the Abbey. So I think that by and large the coronation was a great success. I think it did work. I think it was visually very splendid. The cameras, as I say, could pick it up and relay it all over the world. I mean, those scenes that they do from on high where it all looks like a mosaic are just absolutely fantastic. So it was so much more beautifully filmed than in 1953. And so onwards we go. What's going to happen next? Well, the king, they had the concert. That was very good. Prince William spoke very well. The media have already decided, by the way, that the king was crowned on Saturday and that on Sunday he sat in his chair and the Prince of Wales, Prince William, came forward and made a speech. So now, according to the media, transition has already taken place and everything is focused now on the Prince of Wales. But I'm sure he will be taking a very big part in it. And I'm told also, I think that Princess Anne is also going to be incredibly supportive in this reign. The royal family is now very much slimmed down. The so-called working royals, which is what they invented for the Platinum Jubilee, consist really of the King and Queen, the Prince and Princess of Wales, their children, of course, but they're not actually working at this point, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, that's to say Edward and Sophie, Princess Anne and Tim Lawrence. And then you've got the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, the Duke of Kent and Princess Alexandra. And they are by nature, obviously, a certain age, and they will not be able to take on anything more. And in fact, basically, I'm sure that they will step back a little bit as time goes on. So in a sense, this is going to be a problem for them because people do want members of the royal family to head regiments and do things for charities. You get a much better deal, as any of you who've dealt with the royal family or dealt with a star will be able to say. The royal family actually give much better value. They're much easier to deal with. They don't expect a lot of star treatment. I mean, they just arrive and they do their bit and it's all fantastic. So we'll see what happens. Perhaps I should have just made one other point about the coronation service, which I should have mentioned at the time of the anointing. Wickham Legg, the historian, wrote, "Nothing which goes before and nothing which follows can approach the anointing in significance. Without it, the king cannot receive the royal ornaments. Without it, in a word, he is not king. And it is for that reason that our kings and queens never abdicate. They can't because they're anointed. If the king cannot fulfill his role, as it happened with George III, then you can appoint a regent. So it's very straightforward. And you saw the Queen was able, as you know, to literally do it right up till the day she died. But had she not been able to, Prince Charles could have taken a fuller role. We saw him opening Parliament, we saw him doing the Trooping the Colour. It's a very good balance, and I think that continuity is very important. So there will be no abdicating whatsoever. Now, the king, of course, also has another problem on his hands, which, as I've just been in America, people keep asking me about the whole time, which is to do with Prince Harry and his memoirs and indeed his future. I will show you, therefore, these two. And what I think will happen, if you don't mind me saying so, is that at a certain point, she'll dump him, because she's dumped her father, her first husband, her Canadian lover, Jessica Mulroney, the entire British royal family. Who is next for the chop? Him. And at a certain point, I suppose, either he'll end up in an Airbnb in California trying to get access to his children, or he'll come home, in which case I hope we can treat him as a hostage set free and actually be nice to him and somehow, if possible, get him back into doing what he used to do so extremely well, the duties that he performed. And, you know, when you think that with the Invictus Games, his message, which was a brilliant one, was, don't be a victim. You may be wounded. You can do anything you like. And what's happened to him? He's turned himself now totally into a victim. Richard asked me to mention The Crown, the Netflix series, which I'm very happy to do because, of course, The Crown, as I'm sure you'll agree, is lavishly produced, well acted, beautifully filmed in every possible respect, but it is 100% dishonest. And what they do, and this is why I don't like it, literally from day one I didn't like it, what they do is they sometimes take two episodes which more or less did happen and clash them against each other to make something which didn't happen. One example of that is, for example, yes, the Queen and Prince Philip did entertain the Kennedys for dinner at Buckingham Palace. And yes, years later, Jackie did say to gossips like Gore Vidal and Cecil Beaton one or two disparaging things about what she thought about the palace decor, etc., which were picked up and, of course, used. And yes, the Queen did go to Ghana later that year, but she did not go to Ghana in order to upstage Mrs. Kennedy. She went to Ghana to keep Ghana in the Commonwealth, which was very successful. The worst thing that they did was an episode on Gordonston. And if you happened to have persevered, which I rather hope you didn't, as far as seeing that particular episode, of course, there was a muddy field and some rugger boots and a ball, and then it said Gordonston. I thought, oh, now what's happening? Yes, of course, there was Prince Charles lying in his bed with rain pouring on him, being forced to do runs and all that stuff. And then they flashed back to Prince Philip, and they introduced a scene in which Prince Philip punches a boy, so it's a scuffle with another boy, and so his half-term is cancelled, so he does not go to Darmstadt. And as a result of this, mysteriously, his sister flies over to England and her plane crashes and she is killed in the plane crash. He then goes to her funeral in Darmstadt, where you see lots of Nazis with raised hands and things. And then you see his father, who approaches him and he says, "It's because of you, boy, that I'm burying my favourite child." Well, first of all, no scuffle, no half-term. He wouldn't have gone to Darmstadt. His sister was coming to England. She was indeed killed in a plane crash with her two boys, her mother-in-law, a number of other people, her husband, obviously, and also she was heavily pregnant at the time, and the baby was born and died in the tragedy. And when I did a book about Prince Philip's mother, his archivist said, one thing you should know about Prince Philip is that the worst thing that ever happened to him was when he was called into his headmaster's study to be told that his sister had been killed, and he really minded that desperately. And then his father came to pick him up and took him to the funeral at Darmstadt. And for them to turn that into an episode like that, I thought was utterly disgraceful and the worst thing that they could possibly do. And I do know that Prince Philip did consult his lawyer and was thinking of going to do something about it. But of course, it's terribly difficult because if you attack one scene and not the others, people always think that you don't mind about the other ones. And so I'm glad to say that I had the opportunity, not only I've written books about this, but also to go on the Today Show on BBC Radio 4 one morning and put the story straight, which to some extent meant that at least I don't know, in a small way, the record was put to rights. But that's really why I hate the Crown. And of course, as time has gone on, and as everybody now knows much more about what happens, they mind more and more and more. But I promise you, if you go right back to the beginning, it's just as bad, although he lures you in a little bit, I suppose, because, yes, they did show that the Queen and Prince Philip were once young, and they had various issues that they had to deal with, and Claire Foy, I admit, did a very good job as the Queen. Olivia Colman, no. Awful. She has a cheeky smile, and her mouth was sort of downturned. She always looked glum. I think if you didn't know the Queen, you'd think you wouldn't really like the Queen as played by either Olivia Colman or Imelda Staunton. Personally, that's what I think. We've got one more series to come, apparently, and I'm sure it will be just as bad as all the others. Exactly 50 years on, from the coronation in 1953, the Queen went to Westminster Abbey for a service of Thanksgiving. And I used to run a thing called the Jubilee Walkway Trust, and we had put a panel in the Mall, and we worked out that the Queen would be coming past the Mall on the way back, so we were able, with the approval of her office, to scoop her in and get her to pop out of the car and unveil this panel. And I was absolutely delighted to work out that I was making my very short speech at exactly 12:37, which was the very moment that the crown had been placed on her head some 50 years before, and to which the Queen went, which I thought was a nice acknowledgement of it. And if you want to know more about the coronation, I have written a little book which gives you all the details of what happened in 1953. I can't obviously tell you all that happened in this coronation yet, because it takes time for the diaries to be published and the information to creep out. A little bit of it's coming out gradually now, but it'll be interesting to know what people thought about it then. But that's just a sort of run-through of what happened.